Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. Today is going to be part 2 of my how to use thermoplastic 3-part tutorial, which is part of my how to make a headpiece for makeup, photographic or other purposes series. If you haven't watched the first video on how to use thermoplastic yet and you're a beginner to thermoplastic, I suggest you watch that video before you watch this one. All videos will be up on my channel and they'll be numbered as part 1, part 2 and part 3. This is part 2. So in the last video I spoke about how to create a thermoplastic piece on a flat back and how to build it up to make a relief piece. And I showed you how to make this one here. So if you haven't seen that yet, it's always worth a look, especially if you're a beginner to thermoplastic, because it gives you the basic. And there are going to be certain things that I talked about in the last video that I'm not going to readdress in this one, because this is like a more advanced version of the last video. After this video, I'm going to be doing part 3 as well, which will be on how to get some ideas on how to decorate your thermoplastic creation. So you can see here, I've got 2 examples of the sort of thing I'm going to be making today, and they're both decorated differently. So you can see this one is decorated with a metallic gold and it's got rhinestones embedded and non-embedded, which means that they stick out more. And then this one again has a blue glitter sheen. This blue glitter I used for this is actually a MAC makeup pigment that I dusted over the paint while it was slightly wet. But I'll be going into more detail on how you can decorate your creation in part 3 of this tutorial. So today I'm going to be showing you how to build up a 3D tiara. So today I'm going to be showing you how to create a template like this and eventually bring it round to make it a 3D tiara. Essentially with thermoplastic, the premise is the same or similar. Another thing I'm going to be showing you today is how to cast from silicone moulds. So how, if you have a silicone mould, how to cast thermoplastic into that. And I'm also going to show you how to mould around other objects. So I have my object here that I'm going to be moulding thermoplastic around to show you how you can achieve that as well. So I'm actually making a tiara for the purposes of this video for my client, who is a burlesque artist. And she's essentially given me free rein to be able to do what I want to create this tiara. And she's also told me she's a fan of anatomical hearts. So I have a drawing of an anatomical heart here that I'm going to be attaching into this tiara today. So I've already done this previously. I've also looked on her profile to see a couple more ideas of the sort of style she likes and the things that are going to make it unique once I decorate it, obviously with my own style included. In the last video I showed you how to create a thermoplastic piece by building off a template that was drawn on card or paper like this one here. Now with more advanced projects I also like to draw a rough sketch of what the tiara is going to look like in flat. So you can see here I have my sketch also of my tiara, so I can refer back to this at any point if I want to be able to remember some aspects of the tiara that I can't remember once I start cutting up my template. So if you are likely to forget how your thermoplastic creation needs to look, or it's really advanced like this one here, you might want to draw essentially what is known in the illustration business as a scamp, so what you're going to create your image off of. So with this tiara you can see that there's quite a lot of detail. I'm going to be using 2 different types of thermoplastic on this tiara today. The item that I'm going to mould around, this isn't going to be part of the tiara, this is just to show you how to do that. So it's not going to be part of this creation, but I'll have it for any future creation I want to use it for. I will be talking more about how to attach those as well and how to attach objects together. Another thing that has been quite popular is feathers. So you can see from these 2 examples here and here, my signature in thermoplastic really is feathers. So you can see here that I've got rounded ended feathers and pointed ended feathers. If you watched my last video you saw probably a few more creations that had feathers included like this. So you can see that this is a flat piece but it has feathers added onto it as well. It's kind of my own creation, it's kind of my own thing that I really love to do. I think they look really lovely in thermoplastic, so I like to create them. But you can see from the 3 examples I have here, you can do feathered objects in all different kinds of sizes as well. And the funny story about these feathers is when I originally made this piece here, It was for a cosplay on the shiny version of Dragonair, for any Pokemon lovers out there. And Dragonair has, if you can see here, the designs of the Dragonair here, they have these wing-like ears. And my wings all have that swirl here that is part of that sort of design. So that's what they're inspired by. I really love that kind of imagery. And all my wings have that same swirl. So you can see here the swirls here. And this one, the swirls on there as well. It's just a nice way to top your creation off. You can make wings in many different ways, but this is the way I personally like to stylize my feathers and wings. So as I said, I'm going to be going through a lot of different aspects of how to use thermoplastic in different ways today. And I'm going to start off by putting this to one side and showing you how to create a 3D thermoplastic piece using a silicone mould. So now that I've talked you through all the different types of thermoplastic that you can use, what I'm going to do is show you how to put heat thermoplastic into a silicone mould to create a shape. So I have this shape here. This is actually a mould I made myself. So I bought this silicone from Hobbycraft and I've just pressed it around a decorative vintage frame that I had on one of my pieces of furniture. So it does look a bit rough around the edges, but it does work really well. I've only ever tried this with plaster before in this mould, so I'm not sure whether it's going to be stable enough to work or not. So it's going to be a bit of a voyage of discovery. You can purchase other moulds online like this one here. They do tend to be heat proof because they are silicone. So these are from B&M, as you can see there, they were $1.99. So what I'm going to do is get my silicone mould and I'm just going to cut up really small pieces of thermoplastic into there. And I'm just going to start in small areas to heat that thermoplastic up and press it downward. And then I can get my tool to press it into the mould. And then what I'm going to do is just keep adding more little bits of thermoplastic into this. It just takes a little time and patience. So you're just gently pressing it in, making sure that it doesn't stick to your tool and you don't drag it back out of that mould. And you can just keep adding more as you go. So you can see there that it's started to go in now. It does require a degree of patience to be able to do this, but it will work eventually. So it's just about adding and heating it up, adding and heating it up. So now I'm getting to the stage where I've filled it quite a lot, and now I'm just patching in areas where there's less plastic and I'm just heating that up. So the best thing to do is heat the area underneath and then start putting the pieces of plastic in. It's quite a long process, but as you can see it's starting to work. So I've just layered up these pieces of plastic. It's great to use your offcuts this way. It means that you're reusing pieces of this thermoplastic. A little bit goes into a project, nothing goes to waste. As you can see here, one side is much more full than this side here. So now I'm just going to add a bit more into this side here. It is quite a long process, like I said. It's something that you just have to keep working at. So you can see that I'm just pressing that plastic in with my tool and it's starting to all bond together, which is the main aim of the game, is to make sure that it all bonds nicely together to create one shape. And you want this to fill all the way to the edge of your mould. You don't want to leave it too thin because you want it to be a nice solid piece. So you can see I'm just cutting bits off with my scissors and pressing it on to what's already there, just to fill this mould as much as possible. And then heating that layer up. The other beauty of this is when you do take it out the mould, if it's not quite right, you can put it back in and add more plastic and heat it up again. So, you know, that's a great reason to use thermoplastic in silicone moulds, because you can go back. Whereas if you were to do this with plaster, you probably couldn't add more plaster without it showing. You can do this with thermoplastic, just add a little bit more. Now what I'm going to do is wait for this to fully cool to see now what it looks like, see whether I need to put it back in and add any more plastic, and I'll be back in a little while. Welcome back. Now that this is fully cooled, I'm going to go ahead and take it out of the mould. So this you need to do with a degree of care because they can be quite difficult to get out. So you can see there that it's started to come out in one piece now. And I've got this beautiful frame. So this is now really solid because it's made of thermoplastic. It's got really beautiful little details. There's some areas where there is a few little marks around the edge. I don't mind that because it makes it look extra vintage. It looks ever so lovely. There's a few marks on the front where the plastic hasn't quite bonded together and it looks like cracks. For me that's great because it's a vintage style frame. To avoid that, you just need to keep pressing down and making sure your thermoplastic's warm enough. But it's a really great way of moulding it into your silicone mould. So what I'm going to do now to get this tiara underway is I'm going to draw around this to give myself a basic idea of the sizes I'm going to need for the main design, and then I'll be back tomorrow with the rest of this video. So now that I've created my frame and it's been given time to cool down, I have actually sanded the back of this one because I want it to sit flat to my piece. And now that I've done this, I can show you how exactly I'm going to build my tiara up and how I created other objects. So this is my design here for my tiara again. So you can see that this frame is designed to sit here around that anatomical heart drawing. So you can see on my template here that I've added that in. So essentially by drawing your design on paper, you are able to map out the very lowest basic points of your tiara. So this piece is all going to be one piece, even though you can see these lines here. This is all going to be one piece, and this is going to be the base of your tiara that you curve round to create your 3D piece before you add anything else onto the base. I've drawn around my tiara when creating this template. Then I've built up the rest of the design around it because the frame is going to be the main aspect of this tiara, that is the main size element that I can't change because it's casted from a silicone mould. So you can see there, if you can see now, you can see around here that I've actually drawn a line inward from the edge of where the frame will sit. This is because anything that I stick onto the base element of this is going to be the underneath, and I don't want you to be able to see the edges of it when I build it up. So I'm just going to trim that down. Now as you can see that this is now trimmed down to a smaller size on which to work, and you can see here that if I hold my frame against it, my frame overshadows the entirety now of the card. But what I'm going to do to ensure that once this gets bigger, because you're going to cut the foam out, which is going to make it bigger, and then you're going to envelop it in thermoplastic, which is also going to make it larger, I'm just going to make it a little bit smaller again. So there you have it, I've made it smaller again. Anything that you're going to use that's going to act as a base for another object or design you're going to put on the top of it that you don't want to be seen once your creation is complete needs to be smaller than everything else. And obviously if you watch the first video you'll be aware of this already, that your original design will always invariably be smaller than your final outcome. That is because you will draw around this onto your foam to create your base, and then you will envelop the foam in thermoplastic, which will invariably make it thicker. So just be aware of that. If you want to do any really small detailed piece, you might have to handcraft them, as I did with the loops on the outside of this or the waterline of the eye in the last video. You're perfectly capable of doing that. You can make swirls, curls, whatever you want really, but that is the only way you're going to get a really thin piece like this here. So the next thing that I've done now that I have my frame is that I've drawn around it to ensure that my anatomical heart image that is going to sit in the center of my frame is the right size and is going to sit in that frame at a nice point. and that the background colour is also in there. You're not going to be able to see any of the outer. So now that I have this main point at which I've built everything else, all the rest of my design from my tiara around, I can now begin to make my tiara. So obviously you can see here that these wings don't look much like the wings on my actual creations. This again acts as a base for the feathers to be stuck to. So this is just a basic design and a basic guide of where my feathers are going to go and what they're going to sit against. So you can see here where the original outline of the wing was and where the feathers come further outward. You can probably see it better on this one. So you can see the original wing here compared to where the feathers come out to, and if you look on the front you can see elements of that wing through the feathers, but because the feathers are so built up it doesn't really matter so long as you paint in between the gaps. So you can see where the original wing that would be this piece here was and where the feathers come out to. See, the feathers will be longer than your original piece also. So the next thing I'm going to do is draw around my entire template onto a foam background so I can create my base for my tiara. In the last video I drew my pieces onto different coloured foam to show you how each level, and you can probably still see it through there, how each level was going to sit. Today I'm not going to be doing that. I'm just going to be using white and maybe another colour if I run out of the white. But if you want to see how that development works, please watch the first video. So I'm just going to draw around this entire template now to get my base on which to create the rest of my work. So you can see now I've just drawn the base of my tiara out onto the foam, and I'm just going to go ahead and cut that out now. And as you can see there, I've now cut out the base to my tiara, and again you can see how it's going to bend round to create that tiara shape once I've enveloped it in thermoplastic. Now, when I envelop this in thermoplastic, it will be flat. The reason that I don't add any detail at this stage onto the flat piece that's different to how I did this one where I built areas up is you want to keep it as flat as possible, because when it bends it can crack. So on this one, for example, I didn't add the skull or the feathers until after. It was a very similar sort of shape to this outline here, and then I added the detail on. In some circumstances you won't be able to do that. You will have to build up some areas first, like this one for example, where these wings come higher, obviously another layer of foam here. These are another layer of foam themselves to the background here. As you can see, I made this look 3D compared to the rest of it by creating a built up in flat, but I tried to add as little detail as possible. For example, the feathers I didn't put on this one until afterward, but everything else I did have to build up as a flat image and then curve it round. If you make too much detail on this, like for example if I was to put the feathers on before I curved it round, it will cause a lot of problems, and it will cause areas to crack because of the weight, because of the amount of extra detail on there. So all this design I did do before I curved the tiara itself as one flat piece. So I'm going to add an extra teardrop onto this to show you how that works. So off my original piece I'm going to cut out that teardrop shape like so. So this is going to give it another small dimension, and then I'm just going to get a piece of foam and draw around that again. And as you can see there, that's going to sit there and give it a slight outline. I've not given it a massive amount, just a small outline there, so you can see that this bit is going to sit more 3D to the rest. And now I'm just going to glue that element on. So I'm just going to glue that teardrop straight on as I did before in the last video. So I'm spreading the glue quite thinly because I want it to dry quite fast. I don't want to be waiting forever for this to dry. So you can see now that I've just glued that element on. Again, for anyone that didn't watch the last video, this is the glue I use. This is the original high-tack, very sticky glue. This glue is great for any kind of crafting, but especially this kind of thing. So I do go into more detail about items used in the last video, anything that I didn't use in the last video that I'm going to use in this one, I will obviously go into more detail about. If you're not versed in thermoplastic, you do really want to watch the first one first, because it gives you more detail about the things you're going to need to be able to do it. So the other thing to remember is that when you've got a statement piece like this, which is the piece that I've built the rest of my tiara around, you want to make sure that any other elements you're going to attach are not going to interfere with that area. So you can see here that my teardrop, even though it's 3D, is not touching my frame. So you can see that it's not touching this frame here at all. If you overlap things, it can become a little bit complicated. It can cause some problems, so just be aware of that when you're doing this. Now, on the last video, I showed you how to cover the back of your thermoplastic creation, like so. Today, I'm not going to be bothering doing that because most tiaras sit around your hair or on your head, which means that very little of them is going to be seen from the back. So I usually leave the raw foam area at the back of my tiaras and just paint it the same colour as the tiara. You're not really going to notice this area, so I don't bother covering the back because I find that it's a waste of thermoplastic and a waste of time. When I originally did this one, because it's a larger piece, I did cover the back of this tiara much more neatly than I did on the last video with the piece that I was just showing you how to do it on. But then after I made this one, which was my first one, I realised that it really wasn't necessary when it was sitting on my head, so I've not bothered doing that anymore. So I'm just going to be showing you how to cover the front again today. Another thing to note is that even though I'm going to be going into most detail on decoration in the next part of this tutorial, which will be part 3, some things you do need to embed into your tiara whilst the thermoplastic is still warm. So I have my rhinestone beads here, which are going to sit in this teardrop here, and I'm going to embed that in whilst the thermoplastic is still warm. So not all pieces can be done once the thermoplastic has cooled. Most decoration will have to be done once it's cooled, such as painting or rhinestone in the outside. But if you're embedding embellishments, you need to do that whilst the thermoplastic is warm. Another thing to note before I begin, and I'm sure I'll repeat again later on, is that elements such as this, or elements such as the skull on this piece here, I have had to glue onto the tiara, or I will have to glue this one onto the tiara most likely, because these elements are hollow and don't have any foam inside. So the skull here that I'm going to show you is cast off this original skull here. So you can see it's cast off that original one there. These are elements that are hollow. This area is hollow here, whereas the rest is covered in foam, which makes it more likely that the thermoplastic is going to mould or distort or lose its shape. So always be aware of that when you're creating objects that are hollow or have no foam insert, is that if I was to heat this tiara up now, this area would lose its shape, as would this area, because they do not have a foam insert. So I'm going to be embedding the jewel just like this one here is embedded, and I'm going to be doing that before I decorate it whilst the thermoplastic is still warm. So again, as last time, I have a pair of scissors, I have my trusty metal moulding tool, and I have my heat gun. So these are the items you need to be able to do this. If you didn't watch my last video, a word on safety, always make sure that you have a heat-proof surface or a heat-proof mat available to you when you're working with a heat gun and heat, because thermoplastic needs heat to be able to become malleable enough to mould. But you do need to protect your surfaces, your home and yourself. Some people like to wear heat-proof gloves. I don't personally find it necessary. My heat tool is from Hobbycraft, so it's quite safe. But I just want to point out that obviously if you're using heat, you need to make sure that your surfaces and work area are protected. So now that I've got everything set up, I'm going to get my thermoplastic, and to cover this tiara, as I did in the last video, with my relief piece here, I'm going to be using the Warbler Pearly Art thermoplastic, and I'm going to be using also a clear thermoplastic as well during this tutorial, but to envelop my piece I'm going to be using the Warbler Pearly Art. So I'm going to place that face down on there and cut around this image to make my piece of thermoplastic the right size. Always remember to save your pieces of thermoplastic for future projects, because as I showed you, when moulding my frame for this tiara, the pieces can be reused for other objects and other pieces of work. Now, if anyone struggles to cut thermoplastic, as I am doing here with a larger piece, what I can do is just get a bit of tape and tape this onto my thermoplastic to stop it from moving around, because it's causing me some issues whilst I'm cutting it. Just get a piece of tape and tape the top in place like so, just to stop it from moving while I'm cutting it out. The tape won't do anything to the thermoplastic, it just means that you've got a bit of a easier base on which to cut out your thermoplastic, because before it's heated it can be quite solid and quite difficult to cut, especially when you're cutting around a larger design. Just ensure that if you are going to tape your piece, to make sure you take that tape off before you begin, because you might accidentally melt the tape to your piece, which may cause fumes or may cause other issues. So I'm going to remove my piece of tape now that I've cut that out straight away before I forget that it's there. So you can see that essentially I have a rough thermoplastic outline to work on, and I can now envelop my base in the thermoplastic itself. So what I'm going to do, again as I did in the last video, is I'm going to flip this over and I'm going to heat it to the front of my creation first, holding it in place with my metal tool. And I'm just going to go ahead and heat that. As in the last video, I am going to attempt to edit out as much of the noise of the heat gun as possible, because it is horrible noise, especially on film. It is really ugly. When I edited the last video, I was cringing all the way through the pieces where you could hear this heat gun. So I am going to try and edit out as much as possible for your enjoyment. So now that I've heated a single area, I'm just going to start pressing it around my piece to make sure it starts bonding, especially around the area which is 3D. So you can see at the moment it's still not very warm, it's still not very malleable. Yeah, I can barely mark the plastic at the moment, so I need to make sure that it's going to stick a bit better than it has done so far. So as you can see there now, I've pressed my thermoplastic down around my foam outline, and now I can go ahead and flip that over and start folding the back around. So where it's still warm here, I can already start folding it around to create that outline on the outside like so. So you're going to just fold it around this piece. As I said, if you didn't watch the first video, I went into more detail about how I did this. What I can do for the areas where the wings come in here is I'm going to make a cut so it's easier to fold that piece of thermoplastic around the two elements on both sides like so. So you can see there now I've just made that cut, which is going to make it easier to do that. And I'm just going to now fold this around. When you're doing this, you should be aware that the foam will not take the heat as well as the thermoplastic, so just keep an eye on how warm the foam is getting. Foam tends to be insulating, so it tends to not get too hot, but you do just need to check it every now and again. And as you can see there, I've now got my template fully encased in thermoplastic. This is what the back looks like. As I say, it doesn't really matter. So what I'm going to do now is just gently go around this 3D area here to make sure that it is really defined and not lumpy anywhere. And there I've got that shape nice and defined at the bottom there now. Now that this has been completely encased in thermoplastic, what I'm going to do is you can see that it's not going to want to bend very easily. So what you have to do is saturate the entire piece in warmth to be able to fold it around. So what I'm going to do is go over the whole thing with the heat gun and then gently curve it to how I want it to sit, keeping this area at the front flat because I want that to be sticking out like so it can remain flat, so I can stick my image and my frame to it. So now that my thermoplastic is saturated in heat, it's quite wobbly, so I need to be careful when I'm folding this round and curving it round. It can take a bit of work. So the first thing I'm going to do is fold that teardrop shape outward like so, because that's going to sit against the head. It's not going to sit flat. And then I'm just going to carefully start curving my tiara around like so and hold it in place until it starts to cool. So this does take some time to mould it to the right shape. It won't happen straight away, that's fine. You can just keep gently moulding it. It will feel quite floppy and hard in areas depending on where the heat has permeated the most. So just be aware when you're doing this that can happen. I know that this area hasn't got enough heat, so I'm going to heat those two areas up. And you can see there now that this has started to cool and it's starting to retain its shape a lot better than it did before. I'm still just tweaking it, making sure that it is right, making sure that the shape is going to sit the way I want it to. This can be difficult when you have gems at the front, because obviously if I left that sitting straight downward, it would not go against the client's head. So like this one, you can see that the shape again has the same situation where this point does not point directly downward, it points up at an angle. This is to accommodate for it being against somebody's head. So now that this tiara is essentially the shape I want it to be, obviously the more you heat it, the more you can mould it, but now that it's essentially the shape I want it to be, I need to do a couple of things to ensure that you can actually wear this on your head. This one originally, when I first made it, had clips attached here. I'm not going to do that today because the lady who's going to be wearing this tiara is going to be moving around a fair amount. Obviously she's a dancer, she's a performer, so she's going to want to be able to move whilst wearing this. So what I'm going to do is create a hole here and a hole here in these areas that stick out here, so I can attach some ribbon in for her to be able to pin to her hair. So I'm going to heat that area up and I'm going to make a couple of holes with my tool. So this can be something that you do just like so. So I've just punctured a hole into mine. Obviously as the thermoplastic cools, I don't want that hole to disappear, so I'm just working it with the tool to ensure that as it cools down, that hole isn't going to close up. Essentially I'll be tying a piece of ribbon through these two holes, and what I'm doing is I'm just burying that tool into the bit where it's the widest to create that shape, so I know that both my holes will be the same size. and this will mean that she'll be able to hair grip this to her head, or put an elastic band into these two holes if she prefers to use as a bobble around her hair. Because it's nice having creations that look pretty, but you also want them to be wearable, especially if you are wanting to make a headpiece. So I'm just going to go ahead and do that other hole now. So you can just go straight through the foam and the thermoplastic. It is possible to do. Sometimes you have to heat the thermoplastic from the inside as well. So because I was finding that a little bit difficult, I've just heated the thermoplastic from the inside, and now you can see that my tool is fully in there. You can see that it's now created the shape I wanted it to create, and it's going to retain that shape. So I've now, just by doing something very simple, been able to make this so it is now a little bit more wearable. Obviously you could balance them, but if you're going to be at a convention or you're a performer like the client that I'm making this one for is, you're not going to want to have to do that. So it's always better to have a way of being able to attach these to your head. Personally, I find that to be the biggest issue with most headpieces, is that they're very beautifully made, but they're very difficult to attach to your head. So now that you have this shape, and now that I've made it so it's actually wearable, the issues with adding decoration can be that the shape can change, obviously, as you heat this piece. So you are going to have to be careful. If you have a head mould, you could potentially use that to keep it in shape. Now that it's cool, I can test it against my own head to check that it is going to sit at a good angle. So I'm just going to heat this up from both sides again. And I'm just going to now shape that to make it the right shape I want it to be by curving it round. So it is a trial and error process making the shape correct for what you want to make. There is no quick fix to this. You do just have to keep trial and error in it to see whether it's working for you. But eventually it will work. When letting it cool, you do need to hold it in place, or maybe a bit smaller than you want it, so it has chance to cool into the right shape that you're trying to train it into. So you can see I'm just cupping my hands around this to make it curve into a correct shape. Another way of doing this is getting a bowl or a cup and holding it around the bowl or cup to make sure that it stays in the right shape, like so. This is a medium size-ish tiara, so it's not quite as small as this one here, but it's not quite as big as this one here, so you can see where that sits in the sort of family that I want it in. This one was originally made to go around a large donut hair bun, and this one was made to be a full head tiara. This one's sort of middle ground. It's sort of the best of both worlds, so it's still really statement big tiara, but it's not so huge that my client's not going to be able to dance whilst wearing it. So now that it's cooled again, I can test it again on my head. And you can see that that is now sitting much better than it did before. It's sitting at a really nice angle on my head. That is much more desirable to me than how it sat before. So you can just keep testing it. Obviously make sure that it is fully cool before you put it on your head. You can see that this gem here is now not going to hit me in the head at all. It is going to sit at an angle, but it looks about right when I'm wearing it. So you can see that there. So just keep testing your creation once it's cooled down to make sure it's the right shape. You can see that this area at the front I've managed to keep flat. That is so when I add my frame and other elements, they are going to sit flat. But you can see how it's going to start to come to life once I add that. So now that I have shaped my tiara from flat to a 3D shape, I can now start adding elements that are more intricate onto this. And I'm actually going to start with what I spoke about earlier, which is embedding rhinestones into your creations or other objects. So I'm going to be using one of these in the teardrop of my tiara today, and this is going to sit roughly around here, like so. So all I'm going to do is literally just heat this area up and press that stone in. If the stone will not stay, which sometimes happens, let the thermoplastic cool in the shape where you've pressed the stone in, and then glue it in place, but it will look embedded because it will have that embedded shape already in there. So I'm going to go ahead and heat up this area here now. And I've really steeped that area in heat to make sure that this gem's going to go in. And then what I'm going to do is just get that gem roughly where I want it and press it into the thermoplastic. So you can see that they don't always want to go in, you really have to press them in there. And you can see there that that gem is now embedded into that area. You can see that it now sits in there quite flatly. It doesn't sit quite as flat or quite as embedded as this one because I added another layer of foam to make that area 3D already, which means it's only sitting in the top layer of foam, not the bottom layer. But now I can leave that to cool and that will stay where it is. If it does by any chance fall out, I'll just leave it to cool so the area stays at the right shape for what I want it to look like. And then I can glue the gem in place, but it'll still look embedded because the area of thermoplastic will have cooled to accommodate the shape of that stone. But essentially you can see there that I've now got quite a nice built up area where that stone is sitting. Obviously when you're embedding gems, just remember that you are going to have to paint around them. So if you really are going to struggle painting around them, pull them back out once the thermoplastic has cooled and then paint it and glue them in place. Because this one I painted around, as you can see, I just painted the black around it. But if you feel like you're not confident in doing that, do pull the stone out once the thermoplastic's cooled to a degree where it's going to retain its shape, and then pull the stone out. So now that I have my stone embedded into my framework, I'm going to start considering how I'm going to build up the other areas of detail. So what I'm going to start with is the centerpiece here. So I'm going to grab my frame that I cast earlier, and I'm also going to grab my image, and I'm just going to cut that image out now to around the right size, just so I can work with it a little bit easier. So you can see there, I've just cut my image out, and now I can test to see whether my frame is going to cover all the edges of that image, and I can see that this edge here is still visible slightly, so I'm just going to trim that down slightly. And I can see now that my image is going to fully sit in that frame. So in order to make this look more like a window so that the picture itself isn't going to be able to come into contact with any other elements, I'm going to be using the Thermoplastic Transparent Art, which is a transparent thermoplastic, as you can see. And what I'm going to do is create a little window out of that to place my piece into. So I'm going to draw around my frame onto the thermoplastic by making marks with my tool. I don't know whether you can really see it, but there is a mark there where that frame was. And I'm just going to cut that out. And now I have my little window here. And now I can test that against my frame, and I can see that a couple of areas are hanging over it. So in order to rectify that, I'm just going to trim it down once more. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to heat my clear thermoplastic and then stick it to my frame so it looks like this. So you can see that now this looks like a window, it looks like a glass window. It's got a piece of clear thermoplastic in the centre. So I'm just going to go ahead and heat that transparent thermoplastic up now. Now that that's nice and warm, I'm going to attach my frame to the top of that. And you can see that it has stuck to some degree, but it's not completely stuck down. So what I'm going to do to ensure that that sticks is I'm just gently going to heat the back of this frame, remembering that that if I heat it too much, it won't retain its shape. So now I've heated a small area, I can start blending that clear thermoplastic onto the frame itself to make it stick. checking that the front of the frame is not being altered or changed in its shape whilst I'm doing this, so I am having to be very careful. And now that I've got that partially bonded on, I'm now just going to opt to glue the rest on so I don't change the shape of this frame too much, because as I say, heating it is going to alter the shape of it eventually. So essentially I'm now going to lift up the areas that are not bonded on and glue them down. Resorting to having to glue areas, especially delicate areas that are likely to become obscured through heating them up. And now that I have that layer of glue around there, I'm also going to attach my picture by adding a layer of glue around the picture itself. So I'm just going around the edge of the image in glue, which will dry clear anyway, so I'm not too concerned, but I'm just being as accurate as I can be without worrying too much about it. I'm now going to glue this element down as well, and I'm just making sure with this cotton wool bud that the area that I'm about to cover with the picture is completely clean, because it's transparent, so you want to just make sure that it's as clean as it can be. And then Anna can now glue the picture down into the center. And you can see there now those three elements are in fact glued together. You can see that now that image is encased with a clear piece of thermoplastic. So I'm going to go ahead and let that dry now. Make sure that it's fully dry before I attach it to my piece of work. Essentially, gluing areas is also part of this, because thermoplastic is sticky. It does stick to itself. It does stick to other objects sometimes, but sometimes it doesn't stick as well as being able to glue it on. With the feathers, I'll be showing you how to bond it to itself. I won't be using glue, but for an area that cannot retain its own shape or is likely to become distorted, you need to be a bit more careful, which means using other options such as glue. I have my tiara here, I have my piece that's been glued and heated together, and now I can start making the feathers. So in order to create feathers, what I'm going to do is I'm now going to cut out one of these wing shapes that I created earlier on my template. So I've now got this shape. I only really need one, because what you're going to do for one side is draw around this side, and then for the other side you're going to just draw around that side. It ensures that the feathers, although organic, are going to be to some degree even. So I'm going to get my paper foam again, and what I'm going to do is I'm just going to draw around the shapes that I want to create for feathers. So these tiaras have around 7 feathers on them, so they have one feather that is the main base here, and then they have all the other feathers here. So you want to start with your base feather, and you want to choose whether you want it to come out only so far or whether you want it to be the entire longest feather on your piece. So today I'm going to be doing my base feather like so it is not the full length of the first feather. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to get my pen and I'm going to draw around the end of that wing piece to make my curled feather, and then I'm going to come up to as far as I want this feather to come out, so to about here. The end of the piece is here, and then I'm going to remove this, now I have that shape, and create my curl by hand. You can cut out parts of your template to do this if you don't feel confident doing it by hand, but I prefer to. And then I'm just going to draw my feather shape like so. So another thing you can do with feathers is you can make the edges of them pointy like this. So these feathers are pointed, and these feathers here are rounded, and you can see that this one is a combination of the two. So this one is pointed and the rest are rounded. I'm going to do a combination of the two today, some rounded, some pointed. So now that I have this shape, I'm just going to mark out a couple of areas where gaps are going to be in the feather itself, like so. So I've just drawn a couple of triangles on there that I'm going to cut out in order to bend my thermoplastic into, so I can create the grooves that are in these feathers like this, because you can just push the thermoplastic into these areas. So now that I have my base feather, I'm going to put my template back on here again, and I'm going to go from just over halfway to where I had that other feather, and I'm just going to draw around that first lump there. So you can see I've just drawn around that area there. Now this feather is going to come to around here, so I know that they're going to overlap. And then I can remove this once more, and I can just create that feather shape by joining up that gap and then creating a couple of V shapes again, so I can push the thermoplastic in to make those ridges. You can make as many V shapes as you want on each one. I like to sort of switch it up and do as many as I feel are necessary for the size of each feather. To make the next feather, I'm going to do the same again. So I've already drawn around this one here, so I'm going to put an X on it there. So the next feather down I'm going to draw is this one here. So again, I'm going to place my template and just draw around the edge of that feather. This time I've only got that area of which to work from, so I do have to sort of navigate it by looking at the rest of the shape and looking at how much space there is. So I'm going to freehand this next feather along. And add my grooves like so. So if you're concerned about, you don't know which feather is which, you can always mark them. So you know the feather with the swirl is your front one, but you can mark them number 1, number 2, like so. And I'm just going to carry on now onto the next bump I've got here and do this one, so I can mark that one off because I've already done that one, and I'm going to move on to this one. And again, I've drawn that little curve there, and I'm just going to make the feather shape using that curve, and I'm just going to create a couple of V shapes to create texture to my feather, and I can mark that as number 3. And if I want to be really pedantic about this, I can write 1R because these are the right-sided feathers, so I could write R on all these. As you can see there, I've got 1, 2, 3 R, and then I've just wrote R on this one because I know that that one's the front piece. So now I can mark that one off and go for the next one. So I'm going to go for the 4th bump along, and I'm just going to then draw that feather in. So I'm essentially estimating how long I want them to be, and that's going to be number 4R. And then I can cross that off on my template to remember which ones I've already done. Now the bottom one, you've got this line to follow along here, so you draw around this and follow it along here. So whether you want it to be a full length feather that goes all the way, I'm going to draw mine to about halfway because I'm going to do another set of feathers here as well. So I'm going to draw around that smallest bump now and follow along the bottom. I end up with that, and then I can just join that area up like this, add my V shapes or triangles in to create texture. And as you can see from all of these, the V shapes are in different places. This is so the feathers look more natural and look a little bit more organic. So that is number 5R. So now what I can do is I can cut these feathers out, number 1 through 5. And this is going to give me a indication of where these feathers are going to sit in relation to this piece here or this piece here, which are essentially the same thing. As you can see, that is this piece here. So I'm going to go ahead and cut those out now. And you can see here that I've actually cut this area out. Now what I'm going to do to ensure that you're going to be able to see that swirl is I'm going to take some off this area here so that it's smaller, so that I'll be able to mould the thermoplastic into that area. So you can see now there is a distinct gap between the top curl and the bottom curl here. So I'll be able to push the thermoplastic in to create that curled shape. And I'm also going to cut out these small grooves, triangles that I've made to create the grooves, like so. and each one is going to be different because I've put the triangles in a different place on each one. I'm just going to go ahead and cut the rest out now, and as I cut them out I'm going to place them onto my template to see where they're going to sit in relation to everything else. Now just remember, when you're doing this, I don't mind my feathers and my wings being a little bit bigger than they were originally designed, but if you want them to be the exact right size, you are going to have to consider how much bigger they're going to become once you put the thermoplastic on. As you can see from this template, if I put it around here, you can see thermoplastic around it, which means that the template is smaller than the original, than the piece itself. So you can see from the centre there, look how much more thermoplastic there is around that area. That's because it becomes thicker when you encase it in thermoplastic, and the same thing will happen with your feathers. So I'm just going to go ahead and cut the rest of these feathers out. And now that I'm cutting them out, you can see that I'm just placing them where they will go on that template. So you can see that this feather, this one with the curve, is going to overlap number 1R here, which is how I wanted it to be. So now that I've placed all my feathers onto my template, but you can see that here there is a dead space where there is no feathers. In order to cover that, what you can do is you can measure this area, but what I like to do is get my smallest feather, which is number 5R, and measure how many more you're going to need of that similar sized feather. So I can see here that I need around 3 more just by measuring it against these areas. So what I'm going to do is just draw around this one 3 more times, making the triangles in different areas. And I've just labelled these 6R, 7R and 8R, so I know they're all part of the same set. And what I'm going to do is cut those out and just test them against my template. And you can see there now I have my full range of feathers that I'm going to work with in order to create my wing. So now, in order to create the wing on the other side, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to draw around each of these feathers in turn, but what I'm going to do is draw around the non-pen side, so the non-marked side. You can see this one's marked with an R here, so they face the other way round. These ones will face this way, whereas the other ones will face the other way. So you can see there that I've now got all these drawn out, and they will act as the opposite side to the side I've just done. Now just be aware, when you're drawing around your foam, it means that the outline of these is going to be slightly bigger than the outline of the ones you just did. So I'm just going to take that into account when I'm cutting these out, which I'm going to do now. So there you can see that I've got all feathers now for the other side also. If you're unsure on how many feathers to make, more is always more, so make more than you think you're going to need, because you can keep these little foam pieces to create feathers for other projects. I have quite a few already drawn out on pieces of foam in my toolkit. So again, with this one, you can see that this is just this curve you're not going to be able to push much thermoplastic into. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut away some of this area here. And there you can see that now you can see through that curve, which is going to make it easier to push the thermoplastic into. Now just be warned, if you are going to make feathers out of thermoplastic, it is going to be time consuming, and personally it does my head in. The only reason I do it is because of what great results it yields. It gives you some really lovely results, and they look really nice when they're finished like this. But they are a bit of a pain to do, so just be aware of that when you're doing them. It is quite a slow, difficult process, but it's definitely worth it once you get to this stage where they're going to look like this. So now that I've got all my feathers cut out, I'm going to go ahead and encase them all in thermoplastic. This can be quite an arduous process because you do need to do one by one. I like to do is start with the first sets that are going to be on the bottom. So I've decided that number 1 through 5 are going to be along the bottom area here, and then the others are going to start sitting higher up here like so, and they're going to overlap. So I'm going to start with the bottom feathers. So I'm going to start with 1L, and what I'm going to do is face them up this way so I can still see the number. So I'm going to cut around the thermoplastic this way. Now when cutting around the thermoplastic, you need to make sure that your feather has got enough room for some of the thermoplastic to definitely fold over and touch the back side of your feather. This is because this area that's going to be touching the back side of your feather is what's going to stick it onto your crown itself. So I'm just going to cut around my first feather now. I don't need to cut into those grooves because I will just be able to push the thermoplastic into them. So I end up with something like this, and then all I'm going to do is heat this area up, stick my feather down and fold the edges round as you would with a relief piece. So now that that's nice and warm, I'm just going to place my foam feather in the middle and fold this around and just curve around the edge here. So I'm just folding that around, and because I want this feather to be a rounded feather, I'm going to fold it around without pinching the edge. And then you end up with something like this. So this edge I can just pinch in to make the inner edge of the feather. Then where all those grooves were, I can potentially see them just through the thermoplastic, and I can just start to press those areas in to create the textured shape of the feather. So I'm just pressing those areas in, and you end up with something like this. Now before your feather fully cools, you can choose to bend it and curve it a little bit like so it becomes a little bit more shaped. You can see that it's not quite flat now. This is just to start giving it some more natural shape to it. And then what I like to do is I like to get the pointed end of my tool and just scratch along that feather to create the texture of the feather itself. So I'm just scratching along it to create some marks, to create texture of the feather. And you can see that those marks are coming out from the centre onto the outer edge, just to create the shape and texture of a feather. So you can see there that this feather has now got some texture to it. It's got those lines on it. You can see it better on this one where it's been painted. You can see those lines and what they look like once you paint over them. They're not as clear on a white piece of thermoplastic, but you will be able to see them in person. Next, you want to create the stalk or centre of the feather. This is done by freehanding a piece of thermoplastic, as I did with the piece in the first video. So what I'm going to do is cut a thin piece of thermoplastic around a similar width to my feather. So you can see there, that's a similar length to my feather. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to heat that up and roll it between my fingers. So unlike with the other one, what I'm going to do is just sort of press it and roll it in areas so you can still see the fault line. You can still see areas where this is not completely covered. I like to do this because it just looks a bit more textured, it looks a bit more like a feather, so I've not completely rolled it. And if you look at this example here, again you can see it a bit better where it's been painted. You can see here where it's not fully been rolled over and it looks a little bit twisted, it looks a little bit more textured. So what I'm going to do now to attach this stalk to the feather is heat up those two elements. And then I'm just going to get my stalk and press it onto my feather, making sure that I don't press it too hard so it flattens completely to the feather, but just ensuring that it is stuck down there. And then I can just move it around and make sure that my feather is the right shape that I want it to be. So you can see there that the stalk is wider at the bottom than at the top. That is by design, because that's what feathers usually look like. And you can see that's your first feather there. So in order to now attach this to the crown, I like to attach them to the crown as I go along. You can see that this one has quite a lot of thermoplastic at the back. The thermoplastic, when heated, is what's going to stick this feather to the tiara itself. So you can see there how this is going to stick to the tiara. And all you're going to do again is heat the back of this and the front of this and press it on. And then it should become sticky enough for you to attach the feather to the crown, just like that. You can see here that I've left a gap where my feather is bent to make it look more realistic. What I've done is attach my feather further up than the edge of the template itself. This just gives it a little bit of definition and makes it break this shape a little bit and makes it look a little bit more organic. Now that this is stuck in place to some degree, I'm going to heat the whole thing, and I'm just going to use my metal tool to spread this area down and make sure it's completely attached onto there. So now that this is warm again, I can spread this area down and spread it down onto the base of the crown itself, just to give it a little bit more stick. So you can see there that I've just flattened that area out and spread it down onto the crown itself. And I'm just going to now test it by checking that it is attached everywhere else, and I can see that it is. I can see that once it's cooled it will not come off. Anywhere you feel like is a little bit loose, you can just press it down onto the crown itself. Some areas you can use the tool to scrape it so it becomes flat to the crown, other areas you don't have to. And you can see there that that feather is now attached onto the crown. As I say, start with your lower feathers first and work your way upward. So I'm going to carry on now with my second feather, which will be L2. The other thing to note when you're attaching the feathers is obviously you're heating this tiara again, so you need to just ensure that it is retaining the shape you want it to. You can do this by putting a bowl around it to ensure that while you're moulding that feather on, you are not moving it. I tend to do it by freehand, but you can just leave that bowl there if you're concerned that it's not going to retain its shape. So I'm now going to make the next feather, which is L2. So I've got my second feather now. I'm just going to repeat the same process again. I'm going to cut out an area of thermoplastic and I'm just going to encase the feather in it and stick it to the tiara. So again there, I now have my second feather to go on my tiara. Now when you're applying more feathers, you will find that you need to mould them around the feathers that are already stuck to your crown in order to accommodate the ones that are already there. That can be done just as it's warm. I'm just going to heat this feather up and heat this area up and show you how to do that. So now that these two forces are warm, what I'm going to do is stick my feather on, and I'm going to push this area up to meet this feather here, as you can see, just like that. So they are now moulded around each other and they look part of the same. So basically you're just moulding the next feather around the feather that is already there. So I'm going to heat that up now again and just press some of these areas in to make sure that's fully stuck down again. And as you can see there, those two feathers are now sitting nicely together. What I can do if I want this one to appear more curved is get my tool underneath it and push it upward. So you can see there now that feather appears more curved than it was before. And I'm just going to carry on round now and make number 3 through 5 onto this area here so you can see what they look like. Now as you can see with this feather, I'm going to overlap the one next to it, so you can see that that's just going to slightly overlap there by the way that I've shaped it. This just makes them look a bit more natural, makes them look a bit more organic. And you can see there that that feather is overlapped the one next to it like so. You can apply them any really way that you want. I like to make sure that they overlap in areas and some sit adjacent to each other. This way it looks a little bit more natural, but there is no right and wrong way. This is just the way I've created to work with, but whatever works best for you is good. And you can see now there that I have my first 5 feathers on my tiara itself. You can see that they're all sitting at slightly different angles, they're all bent and curved in different ways. This is to create texture. And what I'm going to do now is move on to my next 3 that are going to sit in the front here, and these are going to be number 6, 7 and 8. And as you can see, this feather here is going to sit in front of the lower feathers that I've already created, so you can see how that one's going to sit once I've attached it on. So what I've done to make sure that this feather sits forward even more is I've just pinched the top and pulled it forward slightly to make it look curved and to make it look like it's sitting further forward. And you can see that now my wing is really starting to create shape because I've got feathers that are layered up. And there you can see that I've got all 8 of my normal feathers now on my tiara, and it's really built up shape. It really does look a lot like a wing. Now just to finish that off, I'm now going to do the feather with the swirl at the end, which is just going to make this look completely complete in this area. So now I have my L piece, my piece that's going to go on the front, and it's going to sit like this over the ends of all those feathers, like so, just to like give the wing an edge, to give it something that's going to make it look completed and give it a bit of definition at that point where the wing ends. So essentially you do the same thing again. You cut around the shape onto the thermoplastic to create your shape, but all you're going to do differently this time when you've cut around that is press into the circular area here to make the curve of your wing. So now I've got my shape, I'm just going to go ahead and heat that up again. And then I'm going to place my foam piece on there and fold it round as I did with all the other feather pieces. And I'm just folding it round the feather like I did before, pushing in those areas where there is a triangle to create the texture, and I'm just folding it round to create that feather. Now when I get to this point here, I'm just going to make a little cut here just to make it easier to fold that area round. So I'm just going to make a little incision there like so, just so I can fold that round a little bit easier. And this time I want this feather to be pointy, so what I'm going to do is pinch this area up to create a point at the end like so. And then I'm just going to fold it around the curve itself as well. Just make sure it's all encased in that thermoplastic. And then all I'm doing to get this edge is I'm pushing it inward there and making sure that it's nicely curved. Then I can flip it over and see I've got something like this. Now I want this curve to face upward, so I can just manipulate it with my hand to make sure that that point is facing upward. And then what I'm going to do now is make sure that this curve is really decent and clean. So I'm just pressing in those areas to make sure that curve is really clean there. And then I'm going to heat up this area in the centre here and gently press into that gap where the curve should be. So I'm just going to gently press in around that curve. I'm just making small marks at a time to create that curved shape. And you can see there that it's now got that curved definition. You can keep going back into it as much as you like to create the shape that you want. And you can see there that I've now got my curl at the end of my feather. Now what I like to do with these is I like to only bring the texture of the feather, the marks that I make, around to this area here. I don't like to bring them all the way around the curve. As you can see here, those marks stop around this area here and they don't go onto the curve, so the curve remains a flat area. This is just my personal preference. You can really do whatever you like. If you want to bring that texture around, you can do. I just prefer not to. And you can see there that I've now started to bend this to create a shape. I'm going to just put it on here to check whether it's going to be in the right place, and I can see that it is. You can see there how that's going to sit and cover up the rest of the area that I want it to cover, and you can see that that feather's going to come out to about there. So I'm just going to go ahead and add the centre of that feather now. And you can see there that that feather has now got the centre. Again, I've only brought it up to a certain point, so this area is left clear. And then I'm going to heat this and the crown up again and attach it on like so. And you can see that I've just curled that feather upwards there to create that shape that I wanted and to complete that wing. So that has just covered all the edges of my feathers that I didn't want you to be able to see, and it's just created the nice shape to finish that wing off. And you can see what it looks like there, and you can see when I add the centerpiece how that's going to look with the wing. and it's starting to all come together now. So now that I've completed this and added all the feathers on, what I can do is, as it cools, I can go back in and make some more scratches into the texture of the feather where I feel like it's lacking. This, when the plastic is cool, is going to give you more shallow marks than when it is warm, which is going to create texture and depth to your feathers. So you'll have deeper scratches and shallower scratches, which is just going to create some interesting marks and depth to that. So you can see there that that's completed now. I'm going to do the other side off camera because essentially it's going to be exactly the same, just the other way round onto this side. But you can see how that looked to start with and how it now looks when you've built the feathers up. And it's really starting to come together now as a tiara and as a piece of work. Just be aware, the more feathers you add, the heavier it's going to become. Thermoplastic isn't hugely heavy. If I drop this, it's not going to break. It is quite solid, which is a great aspect of thermoplastic, which a lot of people use it for, because you can make what look like very breakable ornaments in quite a sturdy way. So before I add that other wing on, which I'm going to do and then come back in the morning to show you how it turned out, I am going to show you how to mould thermoplastic around another object. So I'm actually going to mould thermoplastic around this skull, which is how I created this tiara here. You can see that I just moulded that thermoplastic around that skull shape, and I'm going to be using this brown thermoplastic today. This thermoplastic is thinner than the Warbler Pearly Art and is going to mould a little bit better than the Warbler Pearly Art, so I'm going to use this. But I have the other skull is made from the Pearly Art and not this, because that's all I had, so you can do it. Again, just be aware that when you create shapes on top of other shapes, they haven't got any foam inside to help them retain their shape, so just be aware of that when you're creating these and heating them up. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut a square around my piece, which can be quite difficult to measure because obviously you're going to be moulding around a 3D item. So I'm just going to make sure I've got plenty of thermoplastic to mould around this area. So I can see that that's going to cover the entire face of that skull there. I've got plenty of room to mould that round and inward. Now the other thing is that when you're moulding around other items using thermoplastic, especially other plastic items, they are likely to stick to your item. So this skull is actually a lip balm, which makes it perfect, because what I can do is you can get any kind of petroleum jelly or lip balm and you can just massage that on to the surface on which you're going to be moulding off of. And this is just going to ensure that there's a barrier between the object you're moulding onto and the thermoplastic itself to stop it from sticking to the object. So I've just moulded a bit of that petroleum jelly onto there with my finger. Okay, and what you're going to do now this is fully covered in the petroleum jelly is you're going to heat up your piece of thermoplastic. Once that's nice and heated, you can then go ahead and start pressing it onto the object you want to mould it off and start folding it round. As you can see here, it's quite a fiddly process, so you do have to have a degree of patience when you're doing this. And then what you're going to do is start pressing in areas where it goes inward and start just getting all those little details in there, moulding around your shape and pulling it inward. So you can see that I'm just pressing in those eye sockets there to create that shape, and I'm just pushing it in to create the shape that I want to create. Now that it's on the shape that I'm trying to create, I'm going to go ahead and heat it up again and pick out some of those details. Now just be aware when you're heating this not to heat it too much over whatever you're working on, because whatever you're working on may not be heat friendly. So what I can do to really get into these eye sockets is just use a cotton wool bud and push in to really create the shape of that eye, to really get around that nose and the mouth. And then I can get my metal tool and start picking out areas of detail. This is quite a difficult process. It's not as simple as moulding over foam that you're going to leave inside your object. It can be quite complicated or difficult to do. So you can see there you've got the basic shape. Leave that to cool before you remove the object that it's on top of. And then you can gently remove the object that you've moulded it off, and you end up with something like this. And you can see where the thermoplastic is folded around the edges. It looks a bit like fabric. You can cut that off if you want to, or you can leave it like that if you prefer. Quick way of showing you how to mould off another object. Now you can see that this is completely hollow, so if you were to heat this up again, it would not retain its shape, so you need to be aware of that. So what you can do is, as I say, trim around the edges, as I did with this one here, and I glued it to my tiara as opposed to heating it onto the tiara as I did with the wings. So you can see there that that is a way of moulding around another object. You need to be aware when you're moulding around another object that it might become damaged from doing this, so it needs to be something that you're not worried about becoming damaged. So I'm going to now go, and I'll be back tomorrow to show you how this looks when it's got its other feathers on the other side, and show you how I'm going to attach the centerpiece and create a halo like this to go around the centerpiece. So I will see you later. Good morning. So last night I added the feathers to the other side, so the wings are fully done now and fully attached, and I also glued the frame piece that I did earlier onto the full head piece, and you can see there that it's just glued straight onto there. Now if you look really closely, unfortunately the light is causing a bit of an issue. There are a few bends and ruffles in the paper part itself. Unfortunately that's because I had to glue the paper directly to the thermoplastic underneath, but I glued this area because I wasn't heating thermoplastic onto thermoplastic, so I glued it on. I also found that the structure of this particular piece, because this area here is flat, was a little bit wobbly, it was a little bit unstable, so I've also just added in a piece of foam into the back just to make it a little bit more sturdy. So this, as I say, you can always alter things at the end, you can always add extra things to bolster your creations and make them a little bit more user friendly. So what I'm going to show you now is I'm going to show you how to create a halo like this one has here, and I'm just going to add a small halo around this area here in an oval shape. When I make a halo, I don't use any foam on the inside because I want it to be a nice thin delicate piece. As you can see there, it's well attached. I can actually carry this piece by the halo itself. This tiara is considerably more heavy than this one. That's because it has more elements attached to it. When you're creating these, you need to think about the weight of things and how you're going to carry them, how you're going to package them, if you're going to post them out to people, or if you're going to take them to an event. And then in the third video, I'm going to be showing you how I decorate this one and the piece that I did on the first part of this tutorial. You can see all those feathers, you can see all the detail in them. You'll be able to see that a little bit more once the crown itself is painted, and I'll be showing you how to do a few techniques with painting and decorating your items in the next video. So what I'm going to do is gauge how long I want it to be. So I think a side of this A4 length is probably more than enough. So I'm going to be using this brown warbler thermoplastic today. This is because it provides me a straight edge. I sometimes do this in the pearly art. So I'm just going to cut a strip of this thermoplastic along that edge so I can create my halo shape. Now just be aware when you are creating your thermoplastic pieces, if you do leave them to cool, this has had overnight to cool now, so it's completely solid, you do have to saturate it in a little more heat to attach new objects. Obviously this is because it's usually saturated in heat while you're working on it. Once it's had time to fully cool, you are going to have to saturate it in a little more heat than you would have done working on it all in one go. So I now have this strip, and I can see what that's going to look like on my tiara there. Obviously I'm not going to leave it as this flat expanse of plastic. I'm going to roll it between my fingers, as if you watched the first video you saw me do with the waterline of the eye. So what I'm going to do is just hold that in place and heat that up. Once I've made sure that that's really saturated in heat, I'm just going to start folding it onto itself like so. You can see I'm just folding that inward onto itself to start the process of making that cylindrical shape. And I just like to start the process off by doing this and then rolling it with my fingers. Now I can feel that it's already started to cool quite quickly. Now that I've started that process off, I can go ahead and heat that up again. So now that that's nice and warm, I can start rolling it, and essentially I'm working it like a piece of clay. I'm rolling it and bonding it together to make that cylindrical worm type shape, which is going to create my halo. So it's going to be a nice thin piece, and now that it's warm and rolled around as I want it to be, I'm just making sure every area is nicely rolled. I'm just curving it around to start that process of curving it into the right shape for my tiara. So I can check that it is the right size for my tiara now. So you can see there that that's around how I want it to be. It's about the right size. It is going to come away from that frame slightly just to give it an extra dimension. So what I'm going to do now is heat the areas where I'm going to attach this tiara, and I'm going to attach it in these areas here between the wing and the frame. So what I'm going to do now that I have that shape is I don't want to heat this area again now that I know that it's the right sort of shape that I want. So what I'm going to do is just heat the edges of this curve. So I'm going to heat here and here, which is where I'm going to be attaching it to the tiara, and I'm going to heat the tiara where I want it attached. And then I'm just going to get my tiara and place that on. Sometimes this can be a little bit fiddly depending on what kind of objects you're putting this between. And just mould it into the right place. And you can see that there, that now that's attached. What I'm going to do now is heat those areas up again and just use my tool in a scraping motion to just make sure that this area is not going to come off or away from the rest. When you do start heating this where it is attached, it might start bending backwards, so just be aware of that when you're doing this. It does take a degree of patience and fiddliness to get it right, but you can see on this side now that that piece is completely flattened to the area I want it, and I can do the same on the other side. And I'm just gently convincing that piece to stay where I want it to stay, at the right angle I want it to stay at, while it cools. If you don't do this, it will start falling backwards. As you can probably see here, it is moving slightly. You can see it's falling backwards. So to avoid that, I'm just going to hold it in place. And there you have it. I've added a halo onto my tiara. So it's just added an extra circular dimension around that piece. If I've not got it quite right, I can push it to one side and start encouraging it to sit in the center. So you can see there that I've just added that extra little dimension onto this to create another level. You can see that it is still moving at the moment. That will stop moving as it cools. If it does not, you can add a bit more thermoplastic onto the back in order to ensure that it does stay put. And there you have it, a 3D piece made completely from thermoplastic and a couple of other decorative pieces. You can see that it's now definitely in the family of the other two that I've already created. So you can see that it's definitely in the same family, it's definitely part of the same collection, and it really does have that sense of grandiose beauty, but it's solid, it's made of plastic. If it falls, it's not going to break. Obviously this doesn't make it 100% non-breakable, but it does help, and you do end up with some really beautiful results by persevering with thermoplastic. And you can end up with something that you can sell, or you can use for photographic purposes, or a lot of people use it for cosplay. So this is how you create a 3D piece of art using thermoplastic. Obviously I've shown you how to create a tiara, the way that I like to create tiaras. It's not something I learnt from anybody else. It's something that I just sort of made up as I went along, and I wanted to share it with you. So I hope you've enjoyed this tutorial, and on the next one I'll be showing you how I decorate this and the piece I made in the first video, and I'm going to be giving you some ideas on how you can decorate your thermoplastic pieces. If you already have your own ideas, you don't have to watch that, but I will be going through techniques such as how to make sure glitter stays put once you attach it to a piece. I will be showing you how you can dry brush to pick areas of detail out, and I will be showing you, of course, rhinestoning. So I hope you've enjoyed this video, and I hope that it gives you a chance to really make your own creations and come up with something really beautiful. And I'll see you on the next one. Bye guys!